I do have a sense of national identity and pride, because like the history that I identify with is the Chartists and
Yeah.
these sort of popular movements that were genuinely representative, seeking to create a more genuinely representative um, culture. And I sort of played with this a little bit in the sort of months after I'd come across this history when I hosted a like an online in conversation with Kavita Puri about her brilliant Radio 4 series, £3 in My Pocket, about like early immigration to the UK from India and South Asia. And um, I learnt about the murder of Gurdeep Singh Jagga in Southall. And in response to that murder, there was this. Oh yeah, so I spoke about I tweeted about we spoke about this on the online event, and it's a history that I was ashamed I didn't really know about. I hadn't come across that before. And somebody had responded on, you know, Twitter calling me like a, a lefty bedwetting moron, and that I should go cry somewhere else. It was in the past, and I, needed to, move on basically. And I responded by saying, actually, no, this is part of our national history. And actually, in response to that racist murder, you had like the Southall youth movement was born. And actually, that makes me really proud to be British, because that is
Yeah.
part of our national history.
Yeah.
And
But that same person wouldn't say it's time to move on if you're talking about the war.
yes,
It's very selective about what you should move on from.
Yeah.
But there is this, because I lived in Australia for a long time, and they were talking about Aboriginal rights, and the right, who didn't want to get into this conversation, called it black armband view of history. And they're saying, it was all a long time ago, move on. And they're saying, well, actually, there's still people alive now that were affected by this.
Absolutely,
it's really not that long ago.
So that's a question I wanted to ask, is if you're going to kind of embrace a positive nationalism, how do you do that if you write in the book about BG, your nan, and how she came to England as a result of oppression and some impoverization sorry, by the British and colonialism, and so that's one of the reasons why she moved. I think you do kind of explain that in the book. Is that right?
Yeah.
And so if you're somebody like BG, or if you're one of her descendants, how do you reconcile? And I saying this as well from with a family from an Irish background who also had things taken off them and had a kind of war going on, and because of that violence moved over here to work and send money home. How do you embrace Englishness if Englishness is the thing that's made you have to move to England?
Yeah. I guess I'm not in any way forcing this on anyone. Also, I'm not tied to nationalism. That I think I explained in the book as well. The reason I think like national identity as a force that creates this, this common purpose, is because the way in which our society is set up is, most stuff happens at a national level. I think if there was sufficient meaningful devolution that meant that, cities or regions were able to sort of determine how their neighborhoods were run, then maybe like nationalism would be slightly less important.
But it's such a good point that your discussion of national identity in the book, because obviously we vote nationally. And when we're talking about having a monarchy and we're talking about constitutional reform, that's something that would have to happen on a national level.
Yes.
And currently, Reform and Brexiteers and, prior to that, UKIP, are these people that are writing a story about our national identity that is convincing some people, and writing a different one might be very helpful. And I know there are politicians like Caroline Lucas that have tried to do that in recent books. But that's kind of what you're trying to do as well, is to talk about having an identity as an English person that embraces those difficult histories as well.
Yeah, I think it all comes down to understanding, or the argument I'm making is that these identities aren't fixed. You only run into these problems when you think of them as these sort of static things that have to like be protected or preserved and defended. I think I use the metaphor in the book of of like a uniform. Like you'll never convince everybody to wear the same shirt, but you can perhaps accept that we're all sort of weaving this fabric, like with our own distinct threads. And I think that's the, for me, I can totally understand, and I'm not in any way trying to suggest that those who have experienced sort of hardship because of the history of colonialism or direct colonialism and the sort of the experience of like my grandparents, um, that they should have to sort of become like diehard flag waving like nationalists. I don't think that's true at all, but that's part of the evolution and I feel like I'm in a position where I can sort of make a contribution to that story and perhaps try and change that story moving forwards.
And just I guess acknowledging the trauma and carrying that with you on
Yeah.
your way is not it kind of knits together again this kind of irreconcilable idea of having been forced to move to a country, but then being a citizen of that country and your descendants being citizens of that country.
You said in, I think this is in your talk at Republic's event last year about in the book, I'm sure as well, about how as citizens we should all decide our identity together. And have you decided your identity in terms of is there a clear way of how you would describe Englishness or Britishness that means something?
I don't think there's a way I can just sort of like dash it off in a line. I think just by existing as myself, this is Englishness. and I'm aware that will be in conversation perpetually, like with everybody else I come into contact with. I think that's the thing that there's not like some tick box list of attributes or ideas that I think this is what Englishness is, and I sort of subscribe to that. I'm like, no, I'm sort of living my life as an Englishman, therefore sort of whatever, for me, part of my Englishness is the fact that I speak Punjabi because of the history of colonialism. There's nothing about my Punjabiness that invalidates my Englishness or my Britishness. If anything, it sort of makes it stronger because of the history of colonialism.
So these efforts, I mean, over the last certainly 30 years, I guess governments and people have tried to sort of define it and they do these citizenship tests and things like this, but you don't think that's kind of never going to work, is it?
No, I mean, I think it's a reformulation of like Macaulay's History of England. It's like trying to set out like, well, if we can set out, those of us who are in charge at the top, if we can decide what Britishness is or what Englishness is, then, we can be in control of the narrative. And this is where, in my book, I talk about citizenship, because I think actually those in power want to be so in control of the narrative around national identity that they're basically like taking a bulldozer to the very foundations of it, which is citizenship, like the equality of citizenship. It is the most open aspect of national identity, or an identity that, you can acquire citizenship. My dad acquired British, he became a naturalized British citizen. You can't just fill in a form and sort of become part of an ethnic group. But citizenship is like the bedrock from which national identity has to be built. And, you'll have cultural identity, ethnic identity, all these things will sort of then come into play and sort of swirl into this. And that's why I say it's a bit like a dance. It's this constantly evolving dance.
But you made this interesting point about the power to remove citizenship, which is that if that exists, even regardless of what you think of the person that's having it removed, and there's now a petition in Canada. I didn't realize Elon Musk had Canadian citizenship, but there's now a petition to have it removed.
Oh, right, yeah.
And I just said, well, yes, interesting, but I took your point that if certain people, because of their dual nationality or mixed heritage, they can have theirs removed, then you're no longer an equal citizen.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and it's really a modern thing. Prior to 1918, I think it was 1918, like literally the only way in which you could have your citizenship removed was if you acquired it fraudulently.
Right.
It's a really modern, recent thing, this idea that you can take somebody's citizenship away. It's become like, I think there was some lord said, it's almost become like a driving license or a library ticket.
I thought that was interesting. It was a conservative politician that you quoted in your book, and even
Lord
a
Moylan,
conservative politician was saying that you shouldn't be able to take this away. It's not like it's a driving license or a piece of, a library card, I think was the other example. And that was in reference to people who'd become teenage brides of ISIS and ended up in a completely different country, and then just taking away their citizenship. And there were several things like that had happened where people joined a foreign group and then left, like a terrorist group.
It's like this hangover, this feudal mindset that you can sort of like cast somebody beyond the walls, exile them.
It's interesting because as we're recording, there's a student in the States at university who was part of protests for Gaza and has been sent to a jail in Louisiana, and the idea is that they'll be deported potentially. And it's the same thing. If you can take nationality away from someone, you can take it away from anyone, dependent on whether you agree with them or not, or and if you have a president who is willing to do so, or a government that's willing to do so, that you can strip people of that is very destabilizing, and
massively
speaks to the very homogenous ideas of what national identity is for some people who might decide upon that kind of narrative, rather than the multiplicity that you talk about in your book, and that room for different ideas, people from different places.